October 1943. A United States Navy destroyer escort allegedly vanishes into thin air, teleports across hundreds of miles, and reappears with crew members fused into the ship's metal structure. For over 8 decades, this story has captivated millions, spawned countless books, documentaries, and Hollywood films. But what if I told you that the truth behind the Philadelphia experiment is far more fascinating than the fiction? What if the real science conducted aboard the USS Eldridge was so revolutionary that it changed naval warfare forever, yet somehow became buried beneath layers of conspiracy and misinformation? Today, we're diving deep into one of World War II's most persistent legends, separating historical fact from decades of fantasy, and uncovering the genuine technological breakthrough that sparked this enduring mystery. Welcome to a journey through military history, scientific innovation, and the strange ways that wartime secrecy can transform mundane reality into extraordinary mythology. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment, and it's time we finally set the record straight. Let's begin at the beginning, because every legend needs an origin story. The Philadelphia experiment conspiracy theory didn't emerge during World War II itself. In fact, the first whispers of this supposed incident didn't surface until more than a decade after the war ended. That fact alone should give us pause, but let's follow the thread. The year was 1955. A man named Carlos Miguel Allende, who also went by the name Carl Meredith Allen, sent a series of bizarre letters to Morris Ketchum Jessup, an astronomer and author who had written a book about UFOs. Now, Jessup's book had nothing to do with naval experiments or invisibility, but Allende claimed to have witnessed something extraordinary while serving in the Merchant Marine during the war. According to Allende's letters, in October of 1943, he had been aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth, a Liberty ship, when he personally witnessed the USS Eldridge become completely invisible at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Allende wrote that the destroyer escort not only vanished from sight, but actually teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, hundreds of miles away, before reappearing back in Philadelphia. He claimed that when the ship rematerialized, some crew members were embedded in the ship's steel structure, others went insane, and several disappeared entirely. These letters were rambling, filled with unusual capitalization, strange punctuation, and made references to Albert Einstein's unified field theory. Allende insisted that this experiment had been a practical application of Einstein's theories, designed to make ships invisible to enemy radar, and possibly even to achieve time travel. Jessup, initially intrigued, tried to get more information from Allende, but the correspondence was frustrating and inconsistent. Allende would make bold claims, but provide no verifiable evidence. He would promise documentation, but never deliver. Eventually, Jessup moved on, but this wouldn't be the end of the story. The tale might have died there, forgotten as the ramblings of an eccentric individual, except for what happened next. In 1956, the Office of Naval Research in Washington received a package. Inside was a copy of Jessup's UFO book, but this copy was heavily annotated with handwritten notes in the margins. These notes, written in 3 different colored inks and supposedly by 3 different people, discussed various types of aliens, UFO propulsion systems, and made oblique references to naval experiments. The Office of Naval Research, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, took enough interest in this annotated book to reproduce it in a limited edition. Some researchers claim this official interest validates the Philadelphia experiment story. Others argue the Navy was simply curious about who might be obsessing over their operations during the height of Cold War paranoia. Jessup himself met a tragic end in 1959 when he died in his car from carbon monoxide poisoning, ruled a suicide. Conspiracy theorists have long suggested he was silenced for knowing too much, though there's no evidence supporting this claim, and Jessup had been struggling with personal and professional difficulties. The story lay relatively dormant through the 1960s until 1979, when author Charles Berlitz, famous for his book about the Bermuda Triangle, co-wrote The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility with William Moore. This book brought the legend to a mass audience, presenting Allende's claims as a serious historical mystery worthy of investigation. The book was a sensation. It tapped into post-Watergate distrust of government, fascination with paranormal phenomena, and the public's appetite for secret history. Suddenly, the Philadelphia experiment became part of popular culture. A 1984 Hollywood movie further cemented the story in public consciousness, taking dramatic liberties that made the legend even more fantastic than the original claims. But here's where we need to pump the brakes and ask ourselves some critical questions. What evidence actually supports this extraordinary claim? Let's examine what we know versus what we've been told. First, let's talk about Carlos Allende himself, the primary source for this entire legend. Who is this man, and how credible was his testimony? Researchers who have investigated Allende's background discovered a complex individual with a documented history of mental health struggles. Allende himself later admitted to fabricating parts of his story. In the 1980s, he confessed to a researcher that he had made up the Philadelphia experiment tale, though he later recanted this confession, claiming he had been coerced. This pattern of claim, recantation, and counterclaim is typical of Allende's entire involvement with the story. He was inconsistent, unreliable, and by his own later admission, troubled. This doesn't necessarily mean everything he said was false, but it does mean we need corroborating evidence before accepting his account. So what about that corroborating evidence? Where are the other witnesses? If a massive naval destroyer escort vanished and reappeared with catastrophic results for its crew, surely other people would have seen something. The SS Andrew Furuseth, the ship Allende claimed to be aboard during the incident, had a full crew. Yet not one other crew member from that vessel has ever come forward to confirm Allende's account. Not during the 1950s, not during the media sensation of the 70s and 80s, not ever. What about the crew of the USS Eldridge itself? If the experiment happened as described, with crew members fused into metal or driven insane, there should be dozens of witnesses, medical records, incident reports. Yet no verified crew member has ever confirmed the story. Several sailors who actually served aboard the Eldridge during the relevant time period have explicitly stated that nothing remotely like the Philadelphia experiment occurred. The official Navy records tell a very different story. According to naval documentation, the USS Eldridge was commissioned on August 27, 1943 in New York. During October 1943, the month when the experiment allegedly occurred in Philadelphia, the ship's logs and records show it was actually on shakedown training near the Bahamas and then in New York Harbor. The ship never docked in Philadelphia during that period. Furthermore, the Eldridge's service record shows it departed for the Mediterranean in January 1944 and spent the rest of the war escorting convoys and conducting anti-submarine operations. It was a working warship engaged in the vital but unglamorous duty of protecting merchant vessels. There are no gaps in its service record, no mysterious disappearances, no unexplained repairs that might suggest catastrophic equipment failure or crew casualties. Now, conspiracy theorists argue that the Navy simply falsified all these records to cover up the experiment. But consider the practical challenges of such a cover-up. We're talking about altering ship's logs, duty rosters, personal correspondence from hundreds of sailors, official reports filed by multiple officers, port records from several naval facilities, and the memories of everyone involved. This would require a conspiracy involving thousands of people, all of whom have kept perfect silence for over 80 years. The historical record is clear. The USS Eldridge was exactly where the Navy said it was during October 1943, doing exactly what escort destroyers were supposed to do during wartime. So if the Philadelphia experiment as described never happened, where did this story come from? What kernel of truth might have been distorted into this elaborate legend? This is where our investigation gets truly interesting, because there absolutely was secret experimental work being conducted on naval vessels during World War II. The Navy was indeed testing revolutionary technology that could make ships invisible, just not in the way the conspiracy theory suggests. The real technology was called degaussing, and understanding it requires us to talk about one of World War II's most dangerous threats, magnetic mines. These weapons were devastating and terrifying in equal measure. Unlike traditional contact mines that exploded when a ship physically struck them, magnetic mines could be laid on the seabed and would detonate when they detected the magnetic field of a ship passing overhead. The Germans deployed these weapons with devastating effectiveness, particularly in the early years of the war. A ship could be sailing in water that appeared perfectly safe, with no visible threats, and suddenly be torn apart by an underwater explosion. The psychological impact on naval crews was enormous. How do you defend against an invisible enemy? The magnetic signature of a ship comes from the steel in its hull. As ships are constructed, the hammering, welding, and natural settling of the metal causes the steel to become magnetized by the Earth's magnetic field. This creates a detectable magnetic anomaly that can trigger magnetic mines from a considerable distance. Degaussing was the solution, and it was genuinely revolutionary. The term comes from the name of the unit of magnetic field strength, the Gauss, named after German mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss. To degauss a ship means to neutralize its magnetic field, rendering it essentially invisible to magnetic detection devices. The process works through some elegant physics. Large electrical cables are installed throughout a ship's hull in carefully calculated patterns. When electrical current runs through these cables, they generate a magnetic field that exactly opposes the ship's natural magnetic signature. The two fields cancel each other out, and the ship becomes magnetically neutral. To a magnetic mine or detector, the degaussed ship effectively disappears. This technology didn't make ships optically invisible, but it made them invisible to the specific detection method that was claiming thousands of lives. In the context of naval warfare at the time, this was potentially as valuable as actual invisibility would have been. The United States Navy began extensive degaussing operations in 1941, even before America's entry into the war. The British had pioneered the technology, and the U.S. quickly recognized its critical importance. Naval facilities up and down the Atlantic coast, including in Philadelphia, conducted degaussing operations on hundreds of vessels. Now here's where the connection to our story becomes clear. The process of degaussing a ship involved some phenomena that, to an uninformed observer, might seem quite strange. When powerful electrical currents run through degaussing coils, they can create electromagnetic fields strong enough to cause visible effects. Compass needles spin wildly. Electronic equipment can malfunction. In some cases, there are even reports of a slight haze or shimmer around the vessel, caused by the ionization of air molecules in the intense magnetic field. Sailors who didn't understand the science might describe what they were seeing in dramatic terms. A ship surrounded by a strange glow, equipment going haywire, compass needles spinning. If someone saw this from a distance without context, and then later heard rumors about invisibility experiments, it's not hard to imagine how the story could grow. Moreover, degaussing operations were classified during the war. The Navy didn't want the enemy to know they had developed an effective countermeasure to magnetic mines. This secrecy meant that many sailors, even those who witnessed degaussing, didn't fully understand what they were seeing. Secrecy breeds speculation, and speculation breeds legend. But there's another layer to this story, one that involves the name that Carlos Allende invoked to give his tale credibility: Albert Einstein. According to the legend, the Philadelphia experiment was an attempt to apply Einstein's unified field theory to create a practical invisibility device. This connection to Einstein is crucial to the conspiracy theory because it provides a veneer of scientific legitimacy. So let's talk about Einstein's actual relationship to the Navy during World War II, because unlike the Philadelphia experiment itself, this connection is documented and real. Albert Einstein did consult for the United States Navy during the war. However, his work had nothing to do with invisibility, teleportation, or exotic applications of unified field theory. Einstein's naval work focused on far more practical matters, specifically the behavior of underwater explosions and their effects on ship hulls. He was helping the Navy understand the physics of blast waves propagating through water, information that was vital for both defensive measures and for the development of more effective depth charges and torpedoes. Einstein worked on these projects from his home in Princeton, New Jersey. He never visited the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. He never worked on any project involving electromagnetic fields and ship invisibility. In fact, Einstein's unified field theory, which occupied much of his later life, was primarily a theoretical physics project aimed at reconciling gravity with electromagnetism. It was abstract mathematics, not engineering, and certainly not weapons development. The theory of relativity, Einstein's most famous work, does indeed describe strange phenomena like time dilation and space-time curvature, but these effects only become significant at velocities approaching the speed of light or in the presence of extremely powerful gravitational fields. A ship sitting in a harbor, no matter what electromagnetic fields you wrap it in, is not going to start teleporting or traveling through time. The physics simply doesn't work that way. So why was Einstein's name attached to this story? Because in the post-war period, Einstein had become synonymous with mysterious, almost magical science. The atomic bomb had shown the public that theoretical physics could produce world-changing, almost unimaginable results. If you wanted to make a story about secret naval experiments sound credible, invoking Einstein's name was a shortcut to scientific authority. But science doesn't work on authority. It works on evidence, reproducibility, and logical consistency. So let's examine the scientific plausibility of the Philadelphia experiment as described in the legend. The conspiracy theory claims that intense electromagnetic fields caused the USS Eldridge to become optically invisible and then teleport. Let's break down what this would require from a physics perspective. Optical invisibility through electromagnetic fields would require manipulating light waves as they interact with an object. Modern scientists have indeed made progress toward invisibility technology using what are called metamaterials, substances engineered at the molecular level to bend light around an object. But this technology requires incredibly precise structures smaller than the wavelength of light. You can't achieve this effect by simply wrapping a ship in cables and running current through them. Even if you could generate the right kind of field, the energy requirements would be staggering. We're talking about enough power to bend every photon of light around a 500-foot warship continuously. The electrical generators aboard a World War II destroyer escort couldn't produce a tiny fraction of the necessary power. As for teleportation, this concept has even more profound problems. In quantum physics, there is a phenomenon called quantum teleportation, but it's nothing like the teleportation in science fiction or the Philadelphia experiment legend. Quantum teleportation involves transferring quantum information between particles, not moving physical objects across space. The distinction is crucial. To teleport a macroscopic object like a ship, you would need to scan and record the quantum state of every single atom in the vessel and its crew. The amount of information this represents is almost incomprehensibly vast. Then you would need to destroy the original and reconstruct an exact copy at the destination. Even if the technology existed, which it doesn't, the energy required would be approximately equivalent to the total power output of several nuclear power plants running for months. The conspiracy theory doesn't account for any of this. It simply asserts that electromagnetic fields plus Einstein's theories equals invisibility and teleportation, skipping over the rather important step of explaining the actual mechanism. Then there are the reported effects on the crew. Accounts describe sailors being embedded in the ship's metal structure, others going insane, some allegedly catching fire spontaneously. From a medical and physics standpoint, none of this makes sense as consequences of electromagnetic field exposure. Strong magnetic fields can indeed affect the human body. We use this principle in medical imaging with MRI machines, which generate magnetic fields many times stronger than Earth's natural field. While these fields can cause discomfort and disorientation, they don't cause people to phase into solid metal or spontaneously combust. The idea of a human body merging with metal suggests some kind of matter-phasing technology that violates everything we know about atomic structure and chemical bonds. The atoms in human tissue and ship steel are held together by specific electromagnetic forces. You can't simply mix them together without applying enormous heat and pressure, and even then you'd get a completely different material, not a person embedded in metal. The reality is that the Philadelphia experiment, as described in the legend, is scientifically impossible given our understanding of physics. Not difficult, not highly advanced, but actually impossible without rewriting the fundamental laws that govern how matter and energy interact. So we've established that the conspiracy theory doesn't hold up to scrutiny from the perspectives of historical documentation, witness testimony, or scientific plausibility. But that leaves us with an important question. Why has this story persisted for so long? What makes the Philadelphia experiment such an enduring legend? Part of the answer lies in the nature of conspiracy theories themselves and how they fulfill certain psychological needs. The Philadelphia experiment offers a compelling narrative that combines several elements that humans find inherently fascinating. First, it involves secret government projects. The idea that authorities possess hidden knowledge or capabilities that they conceal from the public is deeply appealing to many people. It suggests that there's more to reality than the mundane world we see every day, and it provides a simple explanation for why people might feel powerless or confused. They're being deliberately kept in the dark. During and after World War II, the government genuinely did conduct many secret projects. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, involved tens of thousands of workers and cost billions of dollars, yet remained successfully hidden from the public and even from most government officials until the bombs were used. The Philadelphia experiment conspiracy theory piggybacks on this real historical fact, suggesting that if one secret project was real, why not another? Second, the story involves advanced science that sounds plausible to non-experts. Terms like electromagnetic fields, unified theory, and invisibility have enough scientific resonance that the story feels like it could be true. Most people don't have the physics background to evaluate these claims critically, so they accept them at face value, especially when they're presented with apparent authority. Third, there's the allure of the unknown and the mysterious. The Philadelphia experiment is more exciting than the truth. Degaussing, while genuinely important and based on elegant physics, isn't as thrilling as teleportation and invisibility. Human psychology tends to prefer the more dramatic explanation, especially when it comes with a hint of danger and cover-up. Fourth, the story has become self-reinforcing. Books have been written, movies made, documentaries produced. Each iteration adds new details, new supposed witnesses, new elaborations on the theme. People encounter the story in multiple forms and contexts, which creates an illusion of corroboration. If something is mentioned in multiple sources, it feels more credible, even if all those sources trace back to the same single, unreliable origin point. The Philadelphia experiment also taps into deeper cultural anxieties about technology and science. The mid-20th century was a period of rapid technological change that was both exciting and terrifying. The same scientific advances that brought television, jet aircraft, and miracle drugs also brought nuclear weapons and the constant threat of global annihilation. In this context, a story about a scientific experiment that goes catastrophically wrong resonates with widespread fears about technology outpacing wisdom. The image of sailors fused into metal is a powerful metaphor for the human cost of unchecked scientific ambition. Whether or not the story is true becomes almost secondary to its symbolic power. It's also worth noting how the Philadelphia experiment legend has evolved over time. The story has proven remarkably adaptable, incorporating new elements as culture and technology have changed. Early versions focused on invisibility and teleportation. Later versions added time travel, alternate dimensions, and connections to other conspiracy theories like the Montauk Project or secret space programs. This flexibility is characteristic of successful conspiracy theories. They're not static, they grow and change to accommodate new information and maintain relevance to contemporary concerns. When one aspect of the story is debunked, believers simply modify that part while keeping the core narrative intact. Now let's shift our focus back to what actually was happening with naval technology during World War II, because the real story, while less sensational than the conspiracy theory, is actually fascinating in its own right and had genuine historical significance. Degaussing was just one part of a broader effort to counter German naval innovations. The Battle of the Atlantic, the prolonged struggle for control of the shipping lanes between North America and Europe, was one of the most critical campaigns of the entire war. Britain depended on supplies from America and Canada. If German U-boats and mines could cut those supply lines, Britain would be starved into submission. The magnetic mine threat was particularly acute in the early war years. In November 1939, just months after the war began, a German magnetic mine was recovered intact by the British after being dropped at low tide. Engineers worked through the night to defuse it, and its recovery was an intelligence coup. British scientists immediately began working on countermeasures, and degaussing technology was rapidly developed and deployed. The Americans, watching Britain struggle, began their own degaussing program even before Pearl Harbor. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was indeed one of the major facilities involved in this work. Hundreds of ships were processed through degaussing stations, where the strength and characteristics of their magnetic fields were measured using sensitive instruments, and then cables were installed to neutralize those fields. This work was conducted in the open, but under wartime secrecy restrictions. Sailors might see ships wrapped in cables or observe the testing procedures without fully understanding what was happening. This combination of visible but unexplained activity is perfect breeding ground for speculation and rumor. The degaussing program was enormously successful. Losses to magnetic mines dropped dramatically once ships were properly treated. The technology saved countless lives and allowed the Allied merchant fleet to continue operating despite determined enemy efforts to disrupt it. In terms of return on investment, degaussing was one of the most cost-effective defensive technologies of the war. But degaussing wasn't the only innovative naval technology being developed. The war drove rapid advancement in radar, sonar, fire control systems, damage control procedures, and countless other areas. Many of these developments were classified at the time and only became public knowledge years or decades later. This historical context is important for understanding how legends like the Philadelphia experiment emerge. There genuinely were secret naval projects. Some involved exotic-sounding physics. Some produced results that might seem mysterious to outside observers. But secret doesn't mean impossible, and classified doesn't mean magical. Let's also consider the USS Eldridge itself, the ship at the center of the legend. What was its actual service record, and how does it compare to the conspiracy theory? The USS Eldridge, designated DE-173, was a Cannon-class destroyer escort. These ships were relatively small, designed for a specific purpose, protecting convoys from submarine attack. They weren't glamorous vessels. They didn't have the speed and firepower of fleet destroyers or the prestige of battleships and carriers. They were workhorses, built in large numbers to fill a desperate need. The Eldridge was constructed at the Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Newark, New Jersey. Construction began in February 1943, and the ship was launched on July 25th of that year. After commissioning on August 27th, the ship began shakedown training, the process of testing all systems and training the crew to operate as a cohesive unit. The ship's initial operations took it to Bermuda for training exercises, then to New York Harbor. In January 1944, the Eldridge departed for the Mediterranean, where it would spend most of its active service. The ship escorted convoys, conducted anti-submarine patrols, and participated in the invasion of southern France in August 1944. The Eldridge's service was competent but unremarkable. It encountered enemy submarines on several occasions, conducting depth charge attacks but never confirming any kills. The ship didn't suffer significant damage during the war and didn't participate in any major dramatic incidents. It was exactly the kind of steady, unglamorous service that characterized thousands of other escort vessels. After the war ended, the Eldridge remained in service for a time, but was eventually decommissioned in 1946. Like many wartime ships that were no longer needed, it faced an uncertain future. However, the Eldridge got a second life when it was transferred to Greece in 1951 as part of the Mutual Defense Assistance Program. Renamed the Leon, the ship served in the Hellenic Navy for decades. Greek sailors who served aboard the vessel in the 50s, 60s, and 70s have been interviewed over the years. None reported anything unusual about the ship. There were no strange equipment, mysterious spaces, or unexplained features that might suggest it had been involved in exotic experiments. The ship was finally decommissioned by Greece in November 1992 and was sold for scrap. The Leon, formerly USS Eldridge, ended its days in an entirely mundane fashion, cut apart for recycling. If the ship had been the site of a revolutionary scientific experiment involving technologies decades ahead of their time, you might expect it to have been specially preserved or secretly dismantled under controlled conditions. Instead, it was scrapped like any other surplus vessel. This anticlimactic ending is typical of the Philadelphia experiment story. At every point where the conspiracy theory predicts something dramatic or mysterious, we instead find ordinary historical reality. But let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Conspiracy theorists would argue that everything we've discussed, all the documentation and witness testimony that contradicts the legend, could have been fabricated or manipulated as part of a cover-up. How do we respond to this argument? The fundamental problem with unfalsifiable conspiracy theories is that they can always retreat to, well, they covered it up, as an explanation for any contradictory evidence. If all documentation can be dismissed as fake, if all witnesses can be accused of being paid liars or suffering from false memories, then the theory becomes impossible to disprove. But a theory that cannot even potentially be proven false isn't a scientific theory at all. It's an article of faith. Consider what the cover-up would require. The Navy would need to have falsified the Eldridge's deck logs, engineering reports, radio communications, and official correspondence, all while maintaining consistency with reports from dozens of other ships the Eldridge interacted with. They would need to convince or silence every sailor who served aboard the ship, every officer who commanded it, every dock worker who saw it in port, every person who had any involvement with or knowledge of its activities. They would need to suppress all medical records for crew members allegedly injured in the experiment. They would need to explain away the absence of these sailors to their families, friends, and hometown communities. They would need to prevent any death certificates, insurance claims, or memorial services that might reveal the truth. And they would need to maintain this absolute secrecy for over 80 years, through changes of administration, shifts in policy, the deaths of everyone involved in the original conspiracy, and the gradual declassification of countless other World War II secrets. The Manhattan Project, which had far stronger security reasons for remaining classified, has been extensively documented. Why would a relatively minor experiment on one escort destroyer remain perfectly secret? The complexity required for such a cover-up quickly becomes absurd. Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually correct, strongly favors the mundane truth over the elaborate conspiracy. Moreover, we can point to many genuine secret military projects that eventually became public knowledge. Stealth aircraft technology, remotely piloted drones, various intelligence programs, all of these were once highly classified, but are now openly discussed. The government has proven itself quite bad at keeping secrets permanently, especially secrets involving large numbers of people. If the Philadelphia experiment had happened as described, we would expect to see the same pattern we see with other declassified programs. Gradual leaks, whistleblowers, official acknowledgement once the technology was no longer current. Instead, we have the opposite, a story that originated with one unreliable witness and has never gained any corroboration despite decades of investigation by believers and skeptics alike. There's another angle worth exploring. Why would the Navy have conducted such an experiment in the first place? Conspiracy theories often fail to establish plausible motivation for the alleged conspirators. The standard explanation is that the Navy was trying to make ships invisible to enemy detection. But we've already established that degaussing accomplished this goal for magnetic detection, which was the actual threat that needed to be countered. Optical invisibility, even if it were achievable, would provide minimal military advantage. Naval combat in World War II was increasingly dominated by radar and sonar. Surface ships hunted submarines using sonar. Aircraft found targets using radar. Long-range gunnery relied on radar ranging. A ship that was optically invisible but still showed up on radar would gain almost nothing tactically. Furthermore, if such technology existed, why was it never deployed? The war lasted another year and a half after the alleged October 1943 experiment. If the Navy had achieved even partially successful invisibility technology, the pressure to deploy it would have been enormous. Ships were being sunk, thousands of sailors were dying, and any advantage would have been exploited. The conspiracy theory needs to explain not only why the technology was never used, but why the entire line of research was apparently abandoned. The usual answer is that the experiment was too dangerous, that the effects on crew members made it unusable. But this doesn't hold up either. Military history is full of weapons and technologies that were dangerous to their operators, but were still deployed because the tactical advantage was deemed worth the risk. If the Philadelphia experiment represented a genuine breakthrough in physics with potential applications to invisibility, teleportation, or time manipulation, the military and scientific communities would have pursued this research relentlessly, even if the initial test had catastrophic results. The knowledge that such things were possible would have been too valuable to abandon. Instead, we see exactly what we would expect if the experiment never happened. No follow-up research, no deployment of related technologies, no theoretical papers exploring the underlying principles, nothing. Let's talk about some of the supposed additional witnesses and evidence that have emerged over the years, because conspiracy theory proponents often point to these as corroboration of the original story. Over the decades since Allende's initial letters, various individuals have come forward claiming connection to the Philadelphia experiment. Some have said they were crew members aboard the Eldridge. Others claim to have been involved in the experiment in various capacities. A few have even said they were subjects in related experiments at other locations. The problem is that not one of these accounts has held up under scrutiny. When researchers have checked these claims against verifiable records, they consistently find contradictions. People who claim to have served aboard the Eldridge during October 1943 turn out to have been on different ships or in different locations. Claimed crew members can't provide details about the ship that actual crew members would know. Stories change between tellings or contradict established historical facts. Some of the supposed witnesses have been exposed as outright frauds, individuals with documented histories of making false claims for attention or profit. Others appear to be suffering from false memories, convinced they experienced something that never actually happened to them. False memories are a well-documented psychological phenomenon. When people are repeatedly exposed to a story, especially one presented as historical truth, they can genuinely come to believe they remember experiencing it themselves. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. We don't replay experiences like a video recording. We rebuild them each time from fragments of information. This process is vulnerable to contamination by external information. Someone who served in the Navy during World War II, who decades later hears about the Philadelphia experiment, might genuinely believe they remember witnessing something related to it. This isn't lying in the conventional sense. The person truly believes their memory, even though it's been inadvertently created by exposure to the legend. This is why contemporary documentation is so much more reliable than decades-old recollections. Memories fade, change, and can be influenced. Written records created at the time, by people who had no reason to anticipate they would become important to a future controversy, are far more trustworthy. What about physical evidence? Surely if an experiment involving massive electromagnetic fields occurred aboard the Eldridge, there would be some physical trace. Modified equipment, unusual wiring, structural changes to accommodate experimental apparatus, something. Here again, we find nothing. The ship's technical specifications as transferred to Greece-matched standard cannon-class destroyer escorts. When researchers have examined photographs of the Eldridge from its service period, they show a completely ordinary vessel. There are no visible modifications that would suggest experimental equipment installation. The conspiracy theory sometimes claims that all experimental equipment was removed after the test, leaving no trace. But removing complex electromagnetic apparatus would leave marks. Bolt holes, paint variations, structural reinforcements that were no longer serving any purpose. Ships that undergo significant modifications leave evidence of those changes that is detectable to experts even decades later. Proponents of the Philadelphia experiment legend often make an argument from government secrecy. If the Navy has nothing to hide, why don't they release all records related to the Eldridge and the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard from that period? This seems like a reasonable question on the surface, but it misunderstands how government records work. First, the Navy has released the Eldridge's deck logs and other documentation. These records are available for researchers to examine. They show the ship's actual movements and activities. The fact that they contradict the conspiracy theory is then used by believers as evidence of falsification, which brings us back to the unfalsifiability problem. Second, there are legitimate reasons why some records remain classified even decades after creation. Documents might contain information about intelligence sources or methods that are still sensitive. They might include technical details about systems that remain in use in modified form. They might contain personal information about individuals that privacy laws protect. The existence of classified records doesn't indicate a cover-up of the Philadelphia experiment any more than it indicates a cover-up of literally anything else someone might imagine. Secrecy is not evidence, it's simply the absence of information. Moreover, the Freedom of Information Act has been used numerous times to request Philadelphia experiment-related documents. The responses have been consistent. No such project existed, therefore no records of it exist. The Navy has officially stated multiple times that the Philadelphia experiment is a hoax. Conspiracy theorists dismiss these denials as exactly what you would expect from a cover-up. But again, this reasoning can be used to support any claim whatsoever. If denial of a conspiracy is treated as evidence for that conspiracy, then the conspiracy becomes impossible to disprove. Let's examine one more aspect of this legend, its place in the broader landscape of conspiracy theories and pseudoscience. The Philadelphia experiment doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected to a whole ecosystem of related claims and theories. The story has been linked to the alleged Montauk Project, a supposed series of secret government experiments in time travel and mind control at Camp Hero in Montauk, New York. According to these claims, the Philadelphia experiment was a precursor to even more exotic research conducted decades later. The Montauk Project claims are even more poorly supported than the Philadelphia experiment. They rely entirely on the testimony of a few individuals whose stories are wildly inconsistent and often internally contradictory. Yet believers in one legend are often believers in the other, seeing them as pieces of a larger puzzle of secret government research. This is a common pattern with conspiracy theories. They cluster together, creating a worldview in which numerous secret projects, cover-ups, and hidden truths are all interconnected. Believers develop what we might call a conspiracy consciousness, a way of seeing the world in which nothing is as it seems and everything is potentially connected to hidden agendas. From a psychological perspective, this worldview serves certain needs. It makes the believer feel that they possess special knowledge unavailable to the masses. It provides simple explanations for complex phenomena. It creates a narrative structure that makes sense of events that might otherwise seem random or meaningless. The Philadelphia experiment, within this framework, isn't just about one alleged incident on one ship. It becomes evidence that reality itself is more mysterious and controllable than mainstream science admits. It suggests that breakthroughs in physics are being suppressed, that technology exists far beyond what we're told, that the government has access to capabilities we can barely imagine. This is appealing. It's far more exciting than a mundane truth that scientific progress is incremental, that governments are often incompetent rather than all-powerful, and that most secrets are kept not because they're profound, but because they're embarrassing or routine. But appealing isn't the same as true, and the consequences of believing in unfounded conspiracy theories can be genuinely harmful. When people lose trust in legitimate sources of information, when they believe that evidence and documentation can all be dismissed as fabrication, they become vulnerable to manipulation by those who peddle false narratives for profit or ideological reasons. The Philadelphia experiment industry, and it is an industry, has generated millions of dollars over the decades. Books, documentaries, movies, conference appearances, guided tours. People have built careers on promoting this legend. This creates a perverse incentive structure where debunking the myth threatens livelihoods, while promoting it generates revenue. Now let's circle back to the genuine science and technology of the World War II era, because there's an important lesson here about how real innovation happens and how it differs from the fantastic claims of conspiracy theories. The degaussing program, the actual invisible ship technology, emerged from a clear military need. The problem was well defined. Magnetic mines were sinking ships. The solution required understanding the physics of magnetism, developing measurement techniques to characterize ships' magnetic signatures, and engineering practical systems to neutralize those signatures. This work involved hundreds of scientists, engineers, and technicians. It required coordination between multiple naval facilities, industrial contractors, and research institutions. Papers were written, though classified. Tests were conducted, documented, and analyzed. The technology was refined through iterative improvements. Thousands of ships were processed. The results were measurable. Fewer ships sunk by magnetic mines. This is what real military innovation looks like. It's methodical, documented, practical, and ultimately successful at accomplishing its stated goal. It involves many people working together over extended periods. It produces technologies that are then deployed and used. Compare this to the Philadelphia experiment as described in the conspiracy theory. We have a single ship, a single alleged test, catastrophic results that should have killed the program immediately, yet supposedly revolutionary theoretical implications that are never pursued. No documentation, no follow-up, no deployment, no practical application. It's the opposite of how actual military research and development functions. The real story of World War II naval technology is packed with genuine innovations that were far-reaching in their implications. Radar evolved from crude systems that could barely detect ships at sea to sophisticated apparatus that could guide fighters to intercept enemy bombers in darkness. Sonar advanced from primitive listening devices to active systems that could locate submarines with enough precision to attack them effectively. Fire control systems, the computers that helped ships aim their guns, became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating analog mechanical computation to solve complex ballistic problems in real time. Damage control procedures evolved dramatically, with naval architects learning how to design ships that could survive tremendous punishment and crews learning techniques to save vessels that earlier would have been lost. All of these developments were revolutionary in their own ways, but they were evolutionary steps building on established science and engineering principles. They didn't require rewriting physics textbooks or violating natural laws. They were difficult achievements that took brilliant people years of hard work, but they were possible because they operated within the constraints of reality. This is a crucial point that conspiracy theories often miss: the difference between very difficult and actually impossible. The Philadelphia experiment, as described, isn't just beyond World War II technology. It's beyond our current technology. It's beyond any technology we can envision based on known physics. The gap between what was claimed and what was possible isn't a matter of degree, but of kind. Let's talk about Albert Einstein once more, because his name deserves better than to be invoked for pseudoscientific claims. Einstein's actual work during World War II, while less dramatic than the conspiracy theory suggests, was in keeping with his character and his relationship with military work. Einstein was a pacifist for most of his life, deeply opposed to war and militarism. However, the rise of Nazi Germany and the very real possibility that German scientists might develop atomic weapons convinced him that defeating the fascist powers was a moral imperative. His famous letter to President Roosevelt in 1939, warning of the possibility of atomic weapons and urging American research in this area, helped catalyze what became the Manhattan Project. Yet Einstein himself didn't work on the atomic bomb. He wasn't invited to participate in that program, partly because of security concerns about his past associations and partly because his skills weren't directly relevant to the engineering challenges involved. Instead, he contributed where he could, consulting on conventional weapons physics, analyzing problems in fluid dynamics and explosives. This was valuable work, make no mistake. Einstein's insights into the behavior of shock waves helped the Navy improve torpedo and depth charge design. But it was applied physics, not revolutionary new theory. It was Einstein using his profound understanding of nature to solve practical engineering problems, not Einstein creating technologies that violated natural law. After the war, Einstein became an advocate for nuclear disarmament and international control of atomic weapons. He expressed regret about his role, however indirect, in the development of the bomb. He returned to his fundamental physics research, working on unified field theory, not as a weapon development program, but as an attempt to understand the deep structure of reality. Einstein's actual legacy is profound enough without burdening it with fictional experiments. His theories of special and general relativity genuinely revolutionized our understanding of space, time, and gravity. His work on the photoelectric effect helped establish quantum mechanics. His equation E equals mc squared revealed the equivalence of mass and energy, with implications still being explored today. These real achievements dwarf anything in the Philadelphia experiment legend. Einstein showed us that time is relative, that space can curve, that gravity is the geometry of space-time itself. These aren't science fiction concepts. They're demonstrated facts that have been confirmed by countless experiments and observations. GPS satellites have to account for relativistic time dilation, or they wouldn't work. Gravitational waves, predicted by Einstein's equations, were directly detected in 2015. A century after he published the theory. This is what actual revolutionary science looks like. It produces testable predictions. It gets confirmed or refuted by experiments. It leads to new technologies, new observations, new questions. It becomes part of the established framework that the next generation builds upon. The Philadelphia experiment has produced none of these things. It has generated books and movies, speculation and debate, but not one piece of verifiable evidence or theoretical insight that has advanced human knowledge. So where does this leave us? We've examined the legend from every angle: historical documentation, witness testimony, scientific plausibility, cultural context, psychological factors. The conclusion is unavoidable. The Philadelphia experiment, as described in the conspiracy theory, never happened. But I want to be clear about what we're saying and what we're not saying. We're not claiming that everything the government does is public knowledge. We're not saying that there are no military secrets or that classified programs don't exist. We're not even claiming to know everything that happened at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943. What we are saying is that the specific claims about the USS Eldridge, about invisibility and teleportation experiments, about crew members embedded in metal and Einstein's involvement, these claims are not supported by evidence and are contradicted by extensive documentation and the fundamental laws of physics as we understand them. The real story, the story of degaussing and the battle against magnetic mines, is more modest but also more meaningful. It's a story of human ingenuity solving practical problems, of science applied to save lives, of incremental progress leading to significant strategic advantage. There's a tendency in our culture to be disappointed by mundane explanations, to feel that debunking a mystery somehow takes something away from the world. But I would argue the opposite. Understanding what actually happened, appreciating the real achievements of the people who fought World War II, respecting the actual development of science and technology, this enriches our understanding rather than diminishing it. The scientists and engineers who developed degaussing technology deserve recognition for their genuine accomplishment. The sailors who served aboard ships like the USS Eldridge, who faced real dangers in the cold waters of the Atlantic, who spent months away from home protecting the convoys that kept Britain alive, These men deserve to have their actual service honored rather than having their ship conscripted into a false legend. History is full of genuine mysteries that don't require us to invent new ones. World War II involved countless incidents that remain incompletely understood or documented. There are ships that sank under circumstances that were never fully explained. There are operations that remain classified for legitimate security reasons. There are personal stories of courage and sacrifice that have never been fully told. Focusing on fictional mysteries distracts us from exploring these real historical questions. It diverts energy and attention that could be spent on legitimate historical research into chasing phantoms. Moreover, the habit of mind that accepts extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence is a dangerous one. In our current information environment, where false narratives can spread globally in hours, the ability to think critically, to evaluate sources, to distinguish between credible and non-credible information, these skills are more important than ever. The Philadelphia experiment serves as a case study in how legends develop and persist. It shows us how a single unreliable source can spawn an entire mythology. It demonstrates how cultural anxieties and psychological needs can make people receptive to implausible claims. It illustrates how the absence of evidence can be twisted into an argument for conspiracy rather than being recognized as evidence of absence. These are valuable lessons, not because the Philadelphia experiment itself is particularly important, but because the same patterns repeat across countless other contexts. The mechanisms that sustain this one legend are the same mechanisms that sustain medical misinformation, political disinformation, and various forms of fraud and manipulation. Learning to recognize these patterns, understanding how and why people believe things that aren't true, developing the intellectual tools to evaluate claims rigorously, these are essential skills for navigating the modern world. So let's talk about what we can learn from this whole affair, both about history and about critical thinking. The Philadelphia experiment legend teaches us several important lessons if we're willing to pay attention. First, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The more a claim violates established knowledge, the stronger the evidence needs to be to support it. A claim that someone had eggs for breakfast requires minimal evidence. A claim that someone teleported from Philadelphia to Norfolk requires overwhelming, multiply corroborated evidence. Carl Sagan captured this principle beautifully when he said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." The Philadelphia experiment is an extraordinary claim supported by the testimony of a single unreliable witness and no physical evidence whatsoever. This imbalance should immediately raise red flags for any critical thinker. Second, consistency matters. Real events produce consistent evidence from multiple independent sources. When you investigate something that actually happened, witness accounts may vary in details, but they'll agree on the basic facts. Documents from different origins will corroborate the same timeline. Physical evidence will align with testimony. The Philadelphia experiment shows the opposite pattern. Different versions of the story contradict each other. Alleged witnesses provide incompatible accounts. Documents that should confirm the story instead contradict it. This is the signature of a false narrative. Third, scientific literacy is crucial. Many people believe in the Philadelphia experiment because they don't understand enough physics to recognize why it's impossible. The story uses scientific-sounding language, electromagnetic fields, unified theory, time dilation, but it uses these concepts incorrectly, in ways that violate fundamental principles. A person with even a basic understanding of electromagnetism knows that you can't make something optically invisible by wrapping it in current-carrying wires. Someone familiar with relativity understands that its effects are negligible at the speeds and energy levels involved in a ship at dock. Knowledge is a defense against deception. Fourth, understanding how science actually works protects against pseudoscience. Real scientific breakthroughs don't happen in isolation. They emerge from collaborative research. They're published, peer-reviewed, tested, and verified. They lead to further developments. They fit into the larger structure of scientific knowledge. Claims that some revolutionary discovery was made, but then suppressed or hidden don't match how science actually functions. Scientists live to make breakthroughs. Nobel Prizes are awarded for revolutionary insights. The incentive structure of science rewards innovation and discovery, not suppression. Fifth, motive matters. When evaluating conspiracy theories, ask yourself who would benefit from the alleged conspiracy and whether maintaining it would be feasible. The Philadelphia experiment conspiracy would require thousands of people to keep silent, would provide minimal military benefit even if successful, and would need to be maintained across decades and through multiple generations of personnel. Compare this to the very real Manhattan Project, which had a clear strategic rationale, still involved extensive security, but still had leaks and was revealed as soon as the war ended, and whose existence could be confirmed by the physical evidence of atomic weapons themselves. Real conspiracies look very different from fictional ones. Sixth, consider the source. Carlos Allende, the originator of the Philadelphia experiment story, was by his own later admission an unreliable narrator. He had no verifiable credentials. He couldn't produce corroborating witnesses or physical evidence. He changed his story over time. These are all warning signs that should make us skeptical of his claims. In general, be wary of claims that come from a single source, especially if that source has credibility issues. Truth tends to be multiply-attested. Lies tend to come from isolated sources. Seventh, the passage of time can be revealing. True events leave larger evidential footprints as time passes and records are declassified. The Philadelphia experiment has shown the opposite trajectory. As more World War II records have become available, as historians have studied the period in increasing detail, the evidence for the Philadelphia experiment hasn't grown stronger. It's remained exactly where it started, nowhere. This pattern, where a claimed event becomes less rather than more supported as investigation continues, is characteristic of false narratives. Real historical events become better understood over time as more sources become available. Now, some people might object that we're being too dismissive, that we should keep an open mind about the possibility that something unusual happened, even if we can't verify all the details of the legend. This sounds reasonable, but there's a difference between open-mindedness and empty-mindedness. Being open-minded means being willing to consider new evidence and revise your conclusions if warranted. It means acknowledging the limits of your knowledge and not clinging to positions in the face of contrary evidence. But it doesn't mean giving equal credence to all claims regardless of their evidentiary support. If someone claims to have seen Bigfoot, an open-minded person doesn't immediately dismiss the claim, but neither do they accept it uncritically. They ask for evidence, photographs, physical traces, corroborating witnesses. If this evidence isn't forthcoming, or if the evidence that is provided doesn't hold up to scrutiny, then the open-minded response is to remain unconvinced while staying open to future evidence. The same principle applies to the Philadelphia experiment. We've looked for evidence. Researchers have spent decades investigating this claim. The result has been negative. The open-minded response at this point is to conclude that the event most likely didn't happen, as described, while remaining technically open to future evidence, should any ever emerge. It's also worth addressing a common argument that because we can't prove something didn't happen, we should remain agnostic about whether it did. This reasoning is flawed. We can never prove a negative with absolute certainty. I can't prove there isn't a teapot orbiting Mars, but the absence of any evidence for such a teapot, combined with the lack of any plausible mechanism for it to have gotten there, means the rational conclusion is that there isn't one. The Philadelphia experiment is an orbiting teapot. We can't prove with metaphysical certainty that it never happened, but the total absence of supporting evidence, the presence of contradictory evidence, and the physical impossibility of the claimed events mean that the rational conclusion is clear. Let's address one final aspect of this story, what it tells us about the role of narrative in shaping belief. Humans are storytelling creatures. We understand the world through narratives. A good story can be more persuasive than a mountain of statistics or a shelf full of documents. The Philadelphia experiment is a compelling story. It has mystery, drama, secret government projects, tragic consequences, cover-ups. It fits narrative templates we've been exposed to countless times in fiction. The experiment that goes wrong, the truth that powerful forces want suppressed, the lone witness who knows what really happened. Our brains are wired to find these narrative patterns satisfying. They make sense to us in a way that the messy, ambiguous, often boring reality of historical events doesn't. The real story of degaussing, with its incremental development, its practical engineering challenges, its modest success in reducing mine casualties, doesn't have the same narrative punch. This is why conspiracy theories are so persistent. They're not just claims about what happened, they're stories that satisfy deep psychological and narrative needs. Debunking them with facts and logic often isn't enough, because facts and logic aren't addressing the real reason people believe. Understanding this doesn't mean we should stop debunking false claims. Truth matters, and we should defend it. But it means we need to recognize that changing minds requires more than just presenting evidence. It requires understanding why people are drawn to these stories in the first place and addressing those underlying needs. For some people, believing in the Philadelphia experiment fills a need for wonder in a disenchanted world. For others, it satisfies a desire to feel that they possess special knowledge. For still others, it confirms a worldview in which authorities are not to be trusted. Simply telling these people they're wrong is unlikely to be effective. A more productive approach might be to redirect these impulses toward legitimate mysteries and wonders. The real universe is full of genuinely strange and marvelous phenomena that don't require us to abandon reason. Quantum mechanics describes behaviors that seem impossible but are experimentally verified. Relativity reveals a universe stranger than most science fiction. Evolution has produced biological complexity that dwarfs anything human engineers have achieved. The real history of science and technology is packed with remarkable stories of innovation, discovery, and human achievement. The development of radar, the breaking of the Enigma code, the Manhattan Project, the dawn of the computer age, all of these are fascinating narratives that happen to be true. Studying these real stories is more rewarding than chasing fictional ones, because understanding what actually happened helps us understand how the world works and how human knowledge progresses. Fictional conspiracies might be entertaining, but they don't teach us anything useful about reality. As we approach the end of our investigation, let's consider what the appropriate level of certainty is for historical claims. Some people argue that because we can't be absolutely certain about anything in history, we should treat all claims as equally uncertain. This is a form of radical skepticism that's ultimately self-defeating. In practice, we can be very confident about many historical events, confident enough that treating them as established facts is reasonable. We know Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. We know World War II happened. We know humans have walked on the moon. The evidence for these events is overwhelming, multiply corroborated, and consistent with all available data. The Philadelphia experiment falls into a very different category. Not only do we lack good evidence that it happened, we have positive evidence that it didn't. Records showing the ship was elsewhere, the absence of any contemporary accounts, the physical impossibility of the claimed effects, the unreliability of the sole original witness. This isn't a case where evidence is ambiguous or incomplete. It's a case where the evidence clearly points in one direction. The event as described did not occur. Maintaining uncertainty in the face of such clear evidence isn't admirable open-mindedness. It's a refusal to accept what the evidence tells us. So what should we make of all this? After 90 minutes of investigation, analysis, and exploration, what's our final verdict on the Philadelphia experiment? The verdict is clear. The Philadelphia experiment, as described in the conspiracy theory, is a legend without foundation. It's a story that emerged from a single unreliable source, that contradicts the historical record, that violates the laws of physics, and that has never been corroborated by credible evidence despite decades of investigation. This doesn't mean there's nothing to learn from the story. The Philadelphia experiment legend teaches us valuable lessons about critical thinking, about the importance of evaluating sources, about how narratives can shape belief in ways that override evidence. It reminds us that skepticism is a valuable intellectual tool and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The story also points us toward real history that's worth exploring. The actual work of the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during World War II, the development of degaussing technology, the Battle of the Atlantic, the role of innovation and science in the Allied victory, these are all fascinating topics that reward serious study. Understanding what really happened, appreciating the genuine achievements of the people involved, recognizing the real challenges they faced and overcame. This is more valuable than clinging to a comforting but false legend. As we close this investigation, I want to leave you with a challenge. The next time you encounter an extraordinary claim, whether it's about history, science, politics, or any other domain, don't accept it uncritically, but don't dismiss it reflexively either. Instead, investigate. Ask questions. Look for evidence. Consider alternative explanations. Evaluate sources. Think critically. The tools of critical thinking aren't just for debunking conspiracy theories. They're essential skills for navigating a complex world where information and misinformation, truth and falsehood, are constantly intermixed. Learning to distinguish between them is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. The Philadelphia experiment is a test case, An opportunity to practice these skills on a story that's been around long enough that we can examine it from multiple angles and with access to extensive documentation. Use it as such, learn from it, and then apply those same analytical skills to everything else you encounter. History is full of genuine mysteries, real wonders, and fascinating stories that don't require us to abandon reason or ignore evidence. Seek those out. Explore the real past, with all its complexity and ambiguity. You'll find it far more rewarding than chasing phantoms. The USS Eldridge was a real ship. Real sailors served aboard it. They faced real dangers in a real war. Their actual service, escorting convoys through dangerous waters, protecting the supply lines that kept the Allied war effort alive, that service is worth remembering and honoring. Let's honor it by telling the truth about what happened, by separating fact from fiction, by refusing to let a fascinating but false legend overshadow genuine history. Let's honor the real innovation of the scientists and engineers who developed degaussing technology, who solved the problem of magnetic mines through careful research and practical engineering. And let's honor the principle that truth matters, that evidence matters, that we owe it to ourselves and to each other to be honest about what we know and what we don't know, about what happened and what didn't happen. The Philadelphia experiment never occurred. But the lessons we can learn from examining why people believe it did, those lessons are real and valuable. Take them with you. Use them well. And remember that the real world, understood clearly and honestly, is fascinating enough without needing to invent fictional mysteries to supplement it. Thank you for joining me on this investigation. I hope it's been enlightening, and I hope you'll approach future extraordinary claims with the same critical eye we've applied to this one. The truth is out there, but finding it requires work, skepticism, and a commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads away from an exciting story and toward a more mundane reality. History deserves our respect. Science deserves our respect. Truth deserves our respect. And the real men and women who served their countries during World War II, who made real sacrifices and achieved real victories, they deserve to have their actual stories told rather than being conscripted into myths and legends that never happened. The Philadelphia experiment is debunked. The real story, the story of degaussing and magnetic mine countermeasures, is revealed. And we're all better off for knowing the difference.